Late afternoon, August 14th, 1385. The low sun stretches long shadows across a narrow strip of ground, pinned between two fast-running streams. On the crest of a hill, only a few thousand men stand still behind rough, hurried obstacles. Not because they believe they are stronger, but because they believe their enemy cannot use its full strength here. If that line breaks within the next hour, Portugal may lose its crown, and with it, the right to decide its own future. And in the end, what decides this day is not a question of who is braver, but terrain, and a chain of choices made at the right moment. Why war broke out? In the 14th century, the Iberian Peninsula was a fractured map of competing kingdoms: Castile and Leon, Aragon, Navarre, Granada, and Portugal, tied together by rivalry and by marriage politics. Royal weddings were not personal celebrations. They were tools that could redraw borders within a generation. When King Ferdinand I of Portugal died in 1383, one planned marriage turned succession into a national emergency. Therefore, this crisis was not only about a throne, it was about Portugal's future. For King Juan Fernandez of Castile, the marriage tied to Princess Beatrice offered legitimacy. If a male heir followed, Portugal and Castile could be drawn into a single political outcome that would be hard to reverse. For the faction backing João of Alvares, the goal was to keep Portugal independent, and to keep Lisbon, the kingdom's commercial heart and political symbol, from being controlled by a court beyond its borders. Therefore, the war became a collision between union by marriage and independence by choice. Portugal was smaller, poorer in resources, and divided at home. But it held something priceless: a hardened will from months of resistance, and a command structure able to decide quickly. Castile was larger and better supplied, but it carried an invisible weakness: friction inside its coalition, especially between ambitious French knights hungry for glory and Castilian nobles unwilling to be treated as secondary in their own army. Therefore, strength on paper did not guarantee strength on a narrow, stressful battlefield. To follow this story clearly, we only need 4 anchors. João I of Portugal, João of Alvares, stands at the center of the succession crisis. He needs a decisive victory to secure legitimacy and protect Lisbon. Nuno Álvares Pereira is the field commander who has already proven that disciplined infantry can hold against cavalry. His instincts lean toward turning fewer into steadier. Juan Fernandez of Castile wants to end the crisis by force, to move on Lisbon and impose a new political order, quickly and publicly. And within Juan's host are elite French knights, heavily armored and confident in their reputation. Yet their privileged position also breeds resentment, and resentment is poison in a combined army. Think of Portugal's force in simple groups: an infantry center holding the main line, missile troops on the wings, and a reserve behind. Castile has a powerful vanguard and an enormous body behind it. But its effectiveness depends on one thing: whether it can act as one army, not several factions marching under one banner. Now we come to the most important character in this battle: the ground. Picture a rise of land with a relatively flat top, but 2 streams running hard along both sides. On a map, going around the hill may look like an option. On the day itself, water, churned earth, and blocked routes make wide deployment difficult. The Portuguese prepare plain, practical obstacles: shallow pits, rough trenches, sharpened stakes, and iron caltrops. Not because these are sophisticated, but because they do one crucial thing: they slow horses, break rhythm, and compress formations. A cavalry charge is not only about courage, it is about speed, spacing, and momentum. Remove those, and the same cavalry becomes vulnerable. In short, this is not a place where 31,000 men can spread out freely and bring their full weight to bear. This is where a larger army cannot deploy all of its numbers at once. Decision point 1. Portugal understands the imbalance. If this fight happens on open ground, Castile can extend its line, rotate fresh men forward, and envelop the smaller force piece by piece. In that scenario, bravery is simply a noble word for a predictable outcome. So João and Nuno refuse to let the war drift back toward another siege of Lisbon. They move first. They choose to block Castile's advance and force a battle on terrain that changes what numbers mean. A hill near Aljubarrota, constrained by streams, offers a way to turn the confrontation into a test of discipline, rather than a contest of manpower. They prepare the approaches with obstacles and place archers and crossbowmen to cover the slopes. Infantry anchors the center, ready to hold position. The design is simple: create a funnel. The more troops Castile tries to push through, the more congestion it creates for itself. That choice immediately reshapes the problem for the invaders. There are no easy wide routes. Left is difficult, right is difficult, and straight ahead leads into ground that compresses movement and punishes momentum. The army behind cannot easily come forward. The men in front cannot easily step back, and orders travel slower than confusion. What makes this decision decisive is not luck. It is a principle. Reduce the enemy's ability to use its advantages. When the landscape forces a fight through a narrow approach, superiority in numbers stops being decisive, and superiority in order begins to matter more. Therefore, from the beginning, the battle becomes a contest over who can keep formation longer. Decision point 2. By midday on August 14th, Castile arrives after a long march. A host of that size is not only physically tired, it is organizationally strained. Lines have to be reformed, command has to be recentered, and supply columns have to be managed. And at precisely the wrong moment, the War Council fractures. One camp presses for immediate battle. Their reasoning is direct. If the Portuguese withdraw or strengthen their position, the chance to end the war quickly could vanish. The other camp argues for rest and reconnaissance. Fatigue, unfamiliar terrain, and haste are how large armies walk into traps. João chooses to deploy and fight that day. A king cannot easily accept the appearance of hesitation in front of a smaller opponent, especially when politics and honor are watching. Castile also attempts to avoid the steepest, best prepared slope by shifting toward a gentler southern approach. A sensible move on paper. But on ground hemmed in by streams, going around does not open a wide new battlefield. It only changes the angle of entry. The choke point still exists. The immediate consequence is that the entire invasion becomes a race against the late afternoon. There is little time to measure distances, little time to refine command, and the pressure to finish the matter today begins to shape decisions. When an army is ruled by time, it tends to choose the simplest solution. Drive forward on one axis and trust that weight alone will break the line. The deeper meaning here is familiar across military history. Defeats often come not from a lack of men, but from a lack of time and patience. A huge army, poorly paced, creates friction inside itself. And on restrictive terrain, small errors expand into major breakdowns. Therefore, before the first weapons meet, Castile brings an invisible disadvantage into the fight. Fatigue, urgency, and reduced room to correct mistakes. Decision point 3. As the afternoon wanes, the elite French knights, around 2,000 by the account in this narrative, form the vanguard. They trust their armor, their horses, and their reputation. Yet inside any coalition, prestige can breed jealousy, and jealousy can show itself as hesitation, delays, and uneven support. The assault begins late in the day, around 6 in the evening. The Portuguese wings, archers and crossbowmen, keep a steady rhythm of fire. Obstacles force horses to slow, stumble, and compress. The charge loses its clean shape and breaks into clusters. In a narrow approach, once the leading cluster is stopped, the ones behind have nowhere to spread out. They simply stack up. Some of the heavily armored men still reach the Portuguese line. When armor meets lighter infantry, there is always a dangerous moment. But the outcome is shaped by distance and time. Slowed cavalry spends longer under missile fire, arrives more disordered, and loses the momentum that makes it lethal. After the first assault, many French knights are taken captive. At that point, João faces pressure. If he does not launch a second attack to recover allies and restore initiative, he risks losing authority and morale throughout the host behind him. Portugal faces its own urgent problem. Prisoners in the rear, while a far larger assault is building. A smaller army cannot allow its rear area to become a volatile crowd at the very moment its front line is about to be tested. The second attack drives into the same constricted route. Men behind continue to press forward, which makes it harder for the front ranks to fall back, pivot, or reset spacing. João remains on lower ground, with a limited view of the choke point. A serious handicap, because once a formation begins to wobble, you need correction in minutes, not in half an hour. Portugal, meanwhile, does something simple and difficult. It holds order. It holds position. It uses the wings to prevent flanking efforts from gaining traction. When a large army is locked into a narrow approach, it does not lose because it is weak. It loses because it cannot breathe. Eventually, once the army's psychological signals begin to break, the sense that movement backward is spreading, withdrawal can become contagious. One group pulls away, another interprets it as collapse, and the chain reaction accelerates. This turning point matters because it reveals what truly breaks mass attacks. Not one dramatic blow, but uncontrolled friction. Portugal turns the battle into a set of manageable problems. Range, rhythm of fire, spacing, and the geometry of the approach. Castile, despite its size, is caught in a corridor where orders travel slower than crisis. Therefore, what destroys the power of numbers is not a single strike, but the army's own congestion and internal friction. After nightfall, João withdraws towards Santarém and soon leaves Portugal as the scale of losses and the breakdown of command becomes clear over the following days. Portugal does not pursue recklessly through darkness. For a smaller force, losing discipline after a victory can be as dangerous as losing discipline while under attack. They hold position and keep order. A choice that is not dramatic, but is strategically sound. In the medium term, João returns to Lisbon with his legitimacy strengthened. The succession crisis shifts decisively in his favor, and Portugal gains time to consolidate authority, rather than living under the shadow of the next siege. Nuno continues pressure, and in this account he even carries the fight into Castile later in 1385 and wins at Valverde, despite once again facing a numerical disadvantage. In the long term, the alliance with England is secured by the Treaty of Windsor the following year, establishing a diplomatic foundation that endures for centuries. Under João's dynasty, later generations, including Henry the Navigator, will help push Portugal toward wider ambitions and outward expansion. In that sense, one afternoon on a hill does not simply end a campaign. It sets a direction that echoes far beyond the battlefield. First, terrain can shrink an enemy's numbers. When you force a larger force into a narrow approach, you turn its advantage into congestion. Second, discipline and command can outlast raw power. A formation that holds rhythm under pressure often survives against a stronger formation that cannot coordinate itself. Third, logistics and time are invisible weapons. Fatigue, poor reconnaissance, and political pressure can turn small errors into fatal mistakes. Aljubarrota matters because it shows how a smaller kingdom can shape its fate by controlling the conditions of the fight. If Portugal loses here, João's new claim could collapse, and the country's independence could be pulled into a settlement defined by Castile. But by using terrain and order, Portugal buys the most valuable currency in politics: time. Time to consolidate rule, secure alliances, and choose its own path. If you'd like, in the next episode, we can unpack the three forces that beat numbers here, how the Portuguese turned a hill into a corridor, why João's decision to fight immediately worked against a massive army, and how the Treaty of Windsor turned a battlefield victory into centuries of security. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and tell me in the comments, should we cover the Treaty of Windsor next, or the Battle of Valverde, 1385?